Pues vamos a empezar. Muy buenos días oficiales a todos y muchísimas gracias por sumarse a este webinar. Mi nombre es Gaby Treiband y les damos la bienvenida en nombre de XM Technologies y de Deceptive Bytes. A modo de breve introducción, XM Technologies es una compañía española con 30 años de experiencia, más de 30 años de experiencia en temas de seguridad, ciberseguridad, de inteligencia en la red, entre otras cosas. Y hemos tenido yo lo llamo a veces, no es la suerte, pero sí la experiencia de haber convivido y participado y ver de primera mano lo que ha sido la transformación digital de los malos y su cambio del modelo de negocio desde lo que era en un principio todo lo ligado más a espionaje digital y que han visto una beta importante de negocio en lo que era el sector privado y la explotación de la información que ellos podían, los malos, los hackers pueden robar. Entonces, mismas armas, mismos técnicas y tecnologías y a partir de aquí, bueno, hemos encontrado formas de detenerlos, de distraerlos, de disuadirlos, junto con partners tan grandes y tan importantes como por ejemplo Deceptive Bytes, que trabajamos con ellos ya bastante tiempo y tenemos un acuerdo, como habéis visto posiblemente, de colaboración conjunta aquí en la zona ibérica y somos sus representantes. Pero la idea es presentarles lo que mismo el equipo de Deceptive Bytes nos van a presentar en este webinar cómo se comporta el malware y el ransomware, cómo luchar contra él o cómo combatirle, utilizando una tecnología muy particular, muy disruptiva y avanzada que se llama Deception. Y tenemos con nosotros a Avi Lamay, que es el CTO y cofundador de Deceptive Bytes. Es un experto en todo lo que tiene que ver con seguridad y decepción, que es el nombre de esta tecnología, y nos va a explicar cómo, además de atacarnos, el malware se protege a sí mismo y darnos también unos tips sobre seguridad. Y también tenemos con nosotros en esta sesión a Sagi Lamay, que es el CEO y cofundador de Deceptive Bytes, y nos va a explicar cómo funciona esta tecnología de Deception y cuál es esta aproximación tan diferente que tiene esta tecnología. We can pass to the next slide, please, to see the agenda. Entonces, lo que vamos a discutir y a presentar hoy es cómo el malware utiliza estas técnicas de evasión, y también cómo lo hace el ransomware, de qué forma intentan protegerse y evadir ellos mismos a los sistemas de seguridad. Y a fin de cuentas, y lo más interesante y lo más disruptivo que tiene esta tecnología es utilizar estas mismas armas que tiene el malware y el ransomware para utilizarlas para atacarles y para contraatacarles a ellos mismos. Entonces eso es súper interesante. Y también vamos a darles unas guías, unas ayudas de cómo incrementar, cómo crecer la seguridad de los endpoints sin instalar o sin utilizar herramientas de seguridad que a fines de cuentas son las que burlan estos tipos de ataques. Y al final, obviamente, como en toda sesión, tendremos preguntas y respuestas. Podéis incluirlas en la sesión de chat y las vamos a preguntar a Sagi y a Avi. Y ahora me van a permitir pasar al inglés, que Avi y Sagi hablan muchos otros idiomas menos en español. Y good morning, guys. Avi and Sagi. So Avi, please, can you tell us about the current threat landscape and some background about it?
Yes, muchas gracias. Buenos días, everyone. As you can see, here are some headlines from about 2 weeks at the end of 2020. As you can see, there were a lot of ransomware attacks, not just then, but also then. And as you can see, they reach millions of dollars just to restore the files and the assets of organizations. They also request that they demand their ransom to avoid leaking data. And as you can see, a lot of companies are attacked daily. Of course, Spain is also a target by threat actors. And of course, this is preventable when you use the proper tools, the proper procedures to defend against such attacks. So let me take you briefly into the history of malware and relevant technologies. So in the 70s and 80s, there were only a few viruses out there, and they were mainly created out of research or as pranks. They weren't meant to be malicious or harm, just to test the field, as they say, and to understand what are those exactly. Now, with the rise of the internet in the 90s, we started to see viruses becoming malicious and emerging alongside, of course, antivirus software, which was created to prevent them. Of course, they mainly used signatures because back then there weren't so many viruses. It was easy for vendors to find the virus, create a signature, and prevent it. By late 90s and early 2000s, we started seeing widespread malware or viruses like Melissa, the I Love You malware, and Blaster, for example. And at the same time, we started to see increase in technologies that try to fight those. For example, with the honeypot technology, which of course is the basis for deception. By mid 2000s, the term APT was coined, which is reference to nation state sponsored malware, where we're not talking about just the malicious malware that is intended to either steal information or infect systems, but also to, of course, espionage and steal secrets. And it's usually attributed to nation states and not common criminals. They were highly sophisticated and, of course, had self-protection capabilities in order to, of course, remain hidden for long periods. As you probably remember, at the beginning of the last decade, in 2010, we started to see APTs not just by hearing about them, but by also hearing a lot of APTs that are in the wild. So people probably remember Stuxnet, which is had been assumed to be developed by Israel and the US. There were other APTs that, were damaging to critical infrastructure and other environments. And of course, in those times, we already started seeing that malware becomes more abrasive, more in large amounts of samples, and of course we started seeing vendors are not able to follow up with all the existing samples, and by 2014 we started to hear that the antivirus is dead. Even the Symantec VP said so. And at the same time, we started seeing the rise of network deception, where the idea of honeypots, which is to try to lure attackers to specific attack areas, started to gain more momentum and more sophisticated. But of course, with the same attempt by protectors, the same happened with attackers. So we started to see more in recent years malware becoming evasive. So if in 2005 we heard about APTs that were the only ones that protected themselves, now in 2015 malware became evasive as a general common thing, and most of them became protective of themselves. And of course, we also saw the rise in ransomware. So we started to see WannaCry, NotPetya, and other attacks. And of course, now we see that there are also malware and ransomware as a service. There's a lot of ways that not just sophisticated attackers, but the simple people can buy malware and, of course, generate attacks. So we see that there's an increase in the number of attacks and their capabilities. So if we look at specifically at malware and ransomware, we see that every 11 seconds there's a company that is attacked by ransomware. So it's not a passing thing, it's here to stay. And of course, the average cost for such an attack is $4.4 million, around almost 4 million euros. As you know, it's not simple and not cheap to recover from such attacks. In 2020, the total damage from ransomware reached $20 billion. So just to give you a comparison to last year and how they earn from such attacks. And just for you to know that 70% of those who paid never really regained their information. A lot of the time you have to trust the bad guys to stay true to their word that they will give you the recovery keys so you'll be able to restore your data. But in most cases, that's not really true. So we see that people pay ransom, and sometimes, as you probably heard, it reaches millions and tens of millions of dollars, but they don't gain their information back. Now, if we look at deception in the real world, we know that in the animal kingdom, various animals deploy deception in either to protect themselves from predators or to become better predators. So in this example, we see squids and octopuses camouflaging themselves. And of course, it's not just in the animal kingdom. In war and in the we know that there's a lot of ways to trick the enemy. So in this example, we see Russian-made inflatables that were used to, of course, as a psychological warfare to pretend that there are more military activity than there actually is. Of course, this is not new. We all remember that in World War II, the US Army deployed a tactic to convince the Nazis to believe that there's an upcoming attack. But of course, it didn't come from a specific direction, but from another. That way, the Allies confused the Germans and, of course, gained the upper end. Now, let's start first, before we explain about malware, let's start with an analogy. So in a bank, robbers will check the security before they actually rob the bank. An advanced bank will give robbers the indicators that it has many security measures, such as cameras, motion detectors, guards, etc. And of course, different obstacles, like different floor plans, fake safes and cameras, etc. These indicators will deter the robbers in the first place, or they will prevent their success in case they do get in. malware behave just like bank robbers. So let me explain exactly how malware works, how it protects itself from being discovered. So malware has different evasion techniques, which are used for the malware to evade being detected by security vendors and security tools. So it helps them to avoid detections by different environments, such as sandbox environment or virtualization environment, which is used in sandbox systems. They know how to detect a security analyst behind the scene and others. So they have different ways to do that, and of course, there are different types of techniques that they use. So if we look at anti-sandbox and anti-virtualization, those environments are usually used by security vendors to create environments where they test malware and to make sure that the files that they test are safe to be forwarded to the target audience, whether, for example, you download an attachment from an email, or if you download a file from the internet, then those systems are meant to scan and analyze the file. And of course, if it's malicious, they will not deliver you the file. Now, malware authors, they know how to detect such environments. They know the different vendors in the arena. They know how those environments look in terms of their configuration, the system information, the environment, and they know how to detect it. So if they see that there's such an environment, either a sandbox like Cuckoo or a VM like VMware, then they know to terminate it themselves in order to avoid being caught. And of course, that way they outrun the sandbox to prevent their early detection. Of course, they have ways to detect malware analyzers and researchers. They try to identify different tools that are used for analysis and tools that are used to debug applications and processes. So if they see something in the background that is trying to analyze them, they will again either terminate or act benign in order to avoid being discovered as malicious. They want to look legitimate to whomever it is behind the scene. Also, and this is interesting, that they don't only know how to avoid sandbox environment and security researchers, but of course they also know how to avoid your existing security tools on your endpoint. So they know how to avoid and evade Windows Defender. It's easily bypassable with a registry key or a PowerShell script. You can disable those with those, and of course continue an attack. Now, this is not limited to Defender. They know how to bypass both traditional AVs and also machine learning and AI. If you probably remember a year and a half ago or so, one of the next-gen AVs vendor had a security issue where when you attached strings from legitimate applications, mainly legitimate games, then it allowed even malware to execute without preventing it. And this is because they look for specific patterns, and malware authors know how to detect those patterns and use their own machine learning and AI to bypass existing or defensive machine learning AI. So they have different ways to avoid being detected also by different AVs. Now, there are about 1,000 or so techniques, evasion techniques like that from different categories. And if we look at how the malware thinks and how it decides what to do, so let's take a look at common examples. So, for example, the malware will search the number of CPUs on the machine. Usually, sandbox environment have limited resources, and with the number of CPUs, they know how to identify such environments. Same goes for the memory size and the hard disk. which have usually in regular machines, they have higher numbers, higher gigabytes than sandbox environments. Of course, they also check that they're not being debugged. Usually, without deception, something is not debugged. The machine name varies, and of course, it's usually not in a VM or a sandbox environment. Now, of course, once you add deception to the mix, what a malware sees is that it's in a very limited environment, usually that represents a sandbox environment, and there's only one CPU and less than 2 gigabytes of memory, etc. And it's under a sandbox or a VM environment. And that way you change the way the malware sees the environment. So if it's without deception, the malware will attack the system. But if it's with deception, the malware will evade it, of course, to avoid being detected by the security environment. So if we look at the malware's decision making, the malware will first test if it's under a VM or a sandbox. It will check if it's being debugged or analyzed. And if the answer to it is yes, then it will either terminate or it will act benign to outrun the sandbox, and that way it will avoid being detected. Now, if it doesn't ask about the environment, or it doesn't care about it, then it will start to attack the system, and it will continue to do so until it's successful. Then, of course, it will complete it and it will accomplish its main purpose. And of course, in case of ransomware, for example, it will demand the ransom. So if we look at an example of how malware exactly does that, I won't go into too much detail, but just to kind of show you the number of ways you have to scan the machine or test the machine for the numbers of CPUs. So in this slide, we see 8 examples, but there are only 8 out of at least 20 ways that you can code in different ways to detect the number of CPUs, and of course terminate if you see that something is suspicious. So this is just to give you an idea how malware authors think, what they do in order to avoid being detected. Now, of course, as I mentioned, they have different ways to do that. So there's something called Mitre attack matrix. As you probably know, Mitre attack is just a representation of and real world observation of how malware and the threat actors operate in real time, in the real world. So we know that they have different techniques, and the matrix represent that, and it has different capabilities listed. Of course, the different categories, the different topics include also defense evasion, which is the top, as you can see, it's the far most used tactic by malware authors in their arsenal. So they have a lot of capabilities that they use to evade being detected by defense measurements. And as you can see, it's a powerful tool to them. ENISA, which is the European Cyber Security Agency, conducted a research regarding vulnerabilities, and they, of course, used the Mitre attack to map the usage of different attack tactics. And as you can see, defense evasion was by far the most used tactic in their research. So a lot of the times, attackers in exploiting vulnerabilities use defense evasion to make sure that their attack is not only successful, but also avoided being detected when they exploit the system. Now, if we look at the clustering of the research, we see that, of course, defense evasion is on top of the hierarchy, and it covers most of the other capabilities as well. So it's their go-to tool when attacking. Now, let's see a demonstration of how malware does that in real time. So here we can see an example from our platform regarding a malware demo. VMD is not a real malware, but it behaves the same way that malware behaves when it tests the system to make sure it's safe for it to run. So in this example, we see that the 32-bit version tries to detect if it's in a sandbox environment. And as you can see, 20 out of 71 vendors detect it as malicious. Now, if we look at the 64-bit version, we see that it uses the same technique to avoid being detected, but because it's a different file, no other vendor detected as malicious, because they look at the signature, and because the files have slightly different signatures, although they come from the same source code, then they're not able to detect it. So of course, because we look at how the malware protects itself and how it accomplishes its target and its goals, we were able to detect it and prevent the attack in the first place. Now, I mentioned it's a demonstration, but it's an open source tool. So what malware authors like to do is to take the source code and implement the functionality, the same prevention, the same defenses into their malware. So we know how to prevent that, and of course, prevent malware even if it's new and doesn't have signatures. So, Sagi, can you please tell us a bit how we use the malware's own defenses against it and how we counteract their attacks?
Sure, thank you very much, Avi. So, as you can already understand, malware is very clever and evasive. Before it actually starts to attack, it checks the environment it's running in, and it uses various ways to evade being detected and analysis by security systems and researchers. For example, a last research shows that more than 98% of all malware today is using at least one sandbox evasion technique. What it means is that every time it sees a sandbox environment, it tries to evade it in one way or another. And additional research shows that every single attack, malware is using at least 10 or more different evasion techniques. So we take advantage of it, and we use the same defenses and techniques malware is using, but we do it against it. Basically, we are shaping the attacker's decision-making, and we are beating them in their own game. And we have two main ways to do that. So the first one is our preemptive defense, which we make malware believe it's in an unattractive or dangerous environment to attack. And by doing so, we are reducing its motivation to attack and the chances of infection. So for example, we make malware believe it's running in a sandbox environment or a virtual machine, or there are many security tools that install on the endpoint. And basically, in that phase, we'll stop more than 90% of malware. Usually, we do that in less than a second or two from the moment they started to operate. It means from the moment they started to understand and test the environment. But you probably ask, what about the additional 10%? So if they don't care about the environment that we created or decide to attack anyway, we also have our proactive defense, which continue with our deception capabilities during the attack in a proactive way and basically changing the outcome of the attack. So for example, if a ransomware starts encrypting files, we'll give it the indicators that it was managed to encrypt them. Of course, at the same time, the solution safeguards them. Basically, we do that in order to make the ransomware stop by itself its malicious activities very, very fast. So if we look at the process of an endpoint attack, we operate through the entire stages from scanning the endpoint at the beginning, once the malware tries to understand the environment, till the actual attack, which means that we increase our ability to stop the attack at any stage. So since the solution looks at how the attacker operates, his tools and techniques, but also how malware behave, and eventually how it protects itself, which is quite the same for different types of attacks, the solution is effective against a variety of threats, including evasive malware, APTs, 0 days and fileless attacks, anything related to malicious links and documents. We are totally agnostic to that as well. Crypto miners, and also ransomware, which eventually use the same evasion techniques to evade being detected. So our advantages is that we can prevent the unknown and sophisticated threats with very high prevention and detection rate. And we do that in real time. It means during the attack itself, during execution. Since we don't scan anything, the solution is very lightweight and consume little to no resources. I will get to some numbers in a minute. And since we don't use signatures, we don't need constant updates, and it can work in a standalone, disconnected, and VDI environments. Also, with knowing only one evasion technique, we are able to prevent millions of future threats. And of course, we do that with low to no existing false positive. And in addition, we develop the solution in user mode, which means that it's more stable than solutions that operate in the kernel mode. This is the user interface on the endpoint. Of course, it shows detected malware and blocked program by IT. As mentioned, it's extremely lightweight. It consumes less than 0.01% CPU, less than 20 megabytes of memory, and less than 1.5 megabytes of disk space. What it means is that it quickly deployed in less than 30 seconds, and then it operates immediately. You don't even need to reboot the endpoints. Since it's signatureless, the update is done every 3 to 6 months, and that's because the evasion techniques don't come often like signatures or patterns. Of course, even if you won't update the endpoints, you will still be protected against unknown threats. And of course, once we do an update, everything is done automatically. You don't need to do anything. And of course, at the same time, we simulate other security tools to detect malware. At the same time, we hide our solution so we are invisible to malware. And we also coexist with other security tools as we automatically detect and whitelist them during the installation. So up until now, we've discussed about the deception engine, which is the main engine of the solution. Also, we have application control, which you can whitelist or blacklist applications, and a behavioral engine that meant to protect legitimate applications being used for malicious attempts. For example, PowerShell or command line that initiated from Word or Excel document. Also, we have a threat intelligence engine and anti-malware and network, which is controlling Windows Defender and Windows Firewall built in the operating system. Basically, we are utilizing the existing AV that already installed on the operating system and provide organizations the ability to utilize it without installing additional security solutions. And of course, everything is managed through our management console, which is also easily deployed in just a few minutes. Then it can be used to deploy the agents through the server. Of course, it supports multi-tenancy. So for global companies, they can use only one management console to control multiple branches, and they can use it on-premise through the cloud or in a hybrid way. It's really up to them. Of course, it has many capabilities, but it also integrates to other systems like SIEM, log, threat intelligence services, sandbox, Active Directory, and as mentioned, Windows Defender and Windows Firewall. So we help organizations protect against unknown and sophisticated threats and prevent damage to their data and assets while reducing reputational risk and operational burden. We help CISOs and IT managers by automating response to detected malware. This helps them reduce loss figures and handling of false positive. And we help the C-level increase efficiency to all employees' endpoints and protect them when working remotely. As a result, we can reduce overall operational costs. Now, Avi will give you some tips on how to increase security. Avi?
Yeah, thank you, Sagi. So there are a number of ways you can increase your security without actually installing more security tools. So the first one is installing either VMware or VirtualBox on your machines. Even without using them, they leave different indicators on the machine itself that could confuse malware into thinking that it's a sandbox or virtual environment. And you can use that, of course, to increase your security. Another option is, of course, to run different Windows executables, like the command prompt, the task managers, and others. Malware sometimes see those executables running and assume there's a researcher behind the scene, and they will try to avoid it by, of course, either terminating or acting as they're legitimate. Same goes to other tools by Microsoft from their sysinternal toolbox. So if you run Process Explorer or auto runs in the background, malware will also think that it should avoid detection because there's an analyzer there. Now, if you want to kind of save some time and do some more simpler actions, then you can create either files or folders like the ones listed, like malware.exe or sample.exe, or the folders sandbox or cuckoo. Those will make malware believe that it's in a sandbox environment, and it will deter it from actually running. And one last option is if you create a specific registry key, the malware will think that it's under a Linux environment and not real Windows, and it might prevent it from actually attempting to attack. So these are our tips. Gabi, back to you. Thank you.
Classic, I was in mute. Okay. Sorry about that. So thank you very, very much, Hena Sagi. Very, very interesting presentation and approach, and see the way that you are using the way that the malware is attacking our systems to just deceive them, and to how to say that, to make them think that this is not an attractive place to be. So let me just ask in Spanish the team or the participants if there are some questions. ¿Hay alguna pregunta que tengáis? Tenéis el espacio del chat para poder hacerlas. Si queréis hacerlas, escribirlas en español, tampoco hay ningún problema. Las traducimos en inglés, y si hace falta explicarlas también o traducirlas, lo haremos sin ningún inconveniente, pero si habéis estado en esta presentación, estimo que entendéis inglés sin problemas. Mientras tanto, in the meantime, while people are asking questions, let me ask one question to you, guys. Just looking at the presentation, it comes to me. So, can deception potentially eliminate the need of having sandbox? And also, do we need to eliminate the antivirus? So it's just one for all?
That's a great question, Gabby. We will never tell customers to eliminate their existing security products. It's up to the customer and his needs. Usually, we can recommend customers that if they want, they can, once the license expired, not to renew their existing AV and use Windows Defender, because of course it's built into the Windows operating system for free, and they can manage it through our platform easily, and of course receive notification from it, and of course be able to manage it in one place. So we help you reduce costs and burden. In terms of sandbox, usually sandbox are used as a precautionary measure, and then they're under the network. So we still recommend, of course, to use them and continue using them. But of course, if customers decide to use their existing AV, they of course can use it alongside Deceptive Bytes. We operate, as Sagi mentioned, we operate next to AVs and EDRs, and of course we detect them automatically and approve them on our side. So of course we can coexist with them.
Excellent. ¿Alguna otra pregunta, equipo, participantes, amigos? I have two questions, but anyway, prefiero... Okay, I have another question in the meantime while people are maybe inspiring them. So in the same way that there is endpoint deception, is there also a network deception? Let's say, can we mislead also the hackers by putting them, let's say, imaginary networks or misleading networks and this stuff?
Yes, so this is what classical network deception does. There are other vendors that do that, but of course this has a limitation. Of course, they have a different. Of course, they have a different purpose. They mainly prevent insider threats and specific attacks. So of course, you can install it as another layer and mainly for the network, but to prevent the malware from actually moving laterally in the network, which is something that the network deception does. It requires that the malware will detect a bait or a lure or whatever it is, and they lure it inside the network. So to prevent that movement of the malware from one location in the network to another, that's why we have our endpoint deception, which tries to, and of course does a lot of things to prevent the malware from attacking and moving laterally in the network. So they have different purposes, and of course we are able to prevent a lot more of attack types, including ransomware, Trojans, etc.
Got it.
Great. We see.
I have a personal question, if you let me. Okay. Sure. So in your, let's call it in your happy days, okay? Have you been hacking or hacking systems or whatever? And do you have any story to tell? To have a smile in our faces when closing this session?
There might be a story or two. I don't know if I should tell those, but mainly my expertise is more on the defensive side. So it's less of hacking and more how to protect.
Okay.
And that of course is how we came up with the idea to use deception and the malware's capabilities against it.
Go ahead. Any story will be excellent.
Yeah, so as a student, it was, I think, yeah, more than, it was 15 years ago, something like that. I discovered a few vulnerabilities in a system that was used by my college. And of course, I turned to the person in charge. We contacted the company. But the funny thing is that they claimed that they fixed it. But I was, after a few days, they installed the updates. And I was able to still bypass the defenses because they tried to do it in a simple way, but they didn't think that people can easily bypass what they did. They did it in the client side, but not in the server. So I was still able to bypass the security measures or supposedly security measures and still exploit the vulnerabilities. Suffice to say that they actually had to fix it properly afterwards.
Good, very good.
Yeah.
Okay, so having no more questions, no, I don't see any. Let's give 10-15 seconds. Maybe somebody already got some question to ask. No matter now, this moment of silence, maybe somebody's typing. So let's close the session here. So closing in time is always good for the values and precious time of everybody here that join us. So thank you very much. First of all, the people that attended this session. I hope that you found it. Perdón, voy a decirlo en español. Muchísimas gracias por haber participado en esta sesión. A quienes se han inscrito y estado aquí, encantados de haberlos tenido aquí. Esta sesión también va a estar grabada, así que podrán encontrar información si hay algún detalle que no quieran o que les haya saltado a la vista. También están invitadísimos a dejarnos sus preguntas en la dirección de email, en las direcciones de emails que pueden ver aquí, info@deceptivebytes.com y infotechnologiesxm.com. Encantados de responder cualquier cuestión, cualquier pregunta y de ayudarles en lo que consideréis oportuno. Y agradecer también, thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Sagi, for your time, for sharing your experience, your know-how, and your informations here. And we'll be happy to help anybody interested in this kind of solutions and others. So let's close the session here. Thank you very much. And have a fantastic day. Que tengáis todos un muy buen día y muchísimas gracias por vuestro tiempo y atención. Hasta pronto.